Hello, welcome to Post Colonial Space and to my course. I'm Mahmoud Raja, and today I will briefly talk about the Palestinian poet Mahmoud Darwish's poem Identity Card. Now, Darwish is considered the national Palestinian poet and produced a lot of poetry, mostly resistance poetry in Arabic language throughout his life. And he was a strong proponent of Palestinian rights and a very strong critic of any kind of control of Palestinian life or territories by the Israeli government. A little bit of the background about the poem itself. Okay, so Identity Card, which in Arabic I think is called Bataqatul Hawiya, right, or Bataqatul Shakhsiya, but the title in Arabic was Bataqatul Hawiya. It's something that every Palestinian living in the West Bank, Gaza, as well as Palestinian Arabs living inside the state of Israel have to carry. And according to my little bit of research now, recently the cards are color-coded. I think if you hold a blue card, that means that you can access the East Jerusalem area and Israeli territories. If you live in the West Bank, your card would be of a different color. But either way, showing your card to enter to work in Israel or through any military checkpoints is absolutely mandatory. And so that's the significance, the material significance of the identity card for the Palestinians. Now, of course, that also then takes us to the topic of, the politics of acquiring an identity card and what you ought to do, right? I mean, think of it this way. I was just listening to the John Lewis interview, who recently passed away. But there was a earlier recorded interview in which the interviewer, Terry Gross, was asking him about the movement to register African Americans to vote in Alabama. And what he would tell you is that there were so many ways in the system, even if it was legally permitted to exclude African American voters. There had to be a literacy test. There has to be other forms that needed to be filled. And all of that was meant to control the African American population in the South. So the fight just wasn't to get the right to vote. The fight also was to get away with the processes that precluded people from becoming fully realized citizens of the United States. So the identity card, in a way, plays the same kind of role within the Israeli-Palestinian politics of the time and even now. So what I'll do is I'll introduce the poem to you. I'll read it a little bit, and then we'll talk about it. What I'm seriously interested in is how does he build the poem up? What are the refrains used and why? And how do we get to the last point? And how the poem, after you've reached the end, becomes a poem that will appeal to a larger, broader audience of humanity and doesn't necessarily remain a Palestinian poem. I think that's the beauty of this poem. So let's take a look at it and read it, and then we can talk about it a little more. So, identity card. Put it on record. I am an Arab, and the number of my card is 50,000. I have 8 children, and the 9th is due after summer. What's there to be angry about? Put it on record. I am an Arab working with comrades of toil in a quarry. I have 8 children. For them I wrest the loaf of bread, the clothes and exercise books from the rocks, and beg for no alms at your door. Lower not myself at your doorstep. What's there to be angry about? So these are the opening lines of the poem. I mean, you can imagine the scene, right? It's some Arab man who works in a quarry giving his ID card to the checkpost, to the soldiers, right? And the refrain, put it on record, in Arabic, I think it is sijil. write it down, right? What does he want them to write it down? Here, I am an Arab, and the number of my card is 50,000. I haven't found a resource for it, but some of my Palestinian friends have told me that the way, before the color coding, the way the cards were numbered would already indicate to a policeman or to anyone looking at your card, would indicate to them whether it was written on your card or not that you were an Arab. And then I have 8 children and the 9th is due after summer. What's there to be angry about? No, that's kind of a dig at a stereotype that's employed for Palestinians, right? A lot of racist Americans as well others would tell you, oh, that these people, they are trying to defeat the Israeli demographic, so they keep producing children. That's the stereotype that is used against Palestinians, and he's putting it front and center. Yeah, I have 8 children and the 9th one is on the way, and I am an Arab, right? Put it on record. This is who I am, right? Then he goes on. What he's saying is that I work at a quarry, right? I'm an Arab and I work hard at a quarry. And that's kind of like the toughest job you can get, right? And what he works to basically provide for his family, just like everyone else. Remember, there are food and school books, exercise books, and that he's proud, right? He works for a living, right? And he does not lower himself to go and get arms or aid or help. All he needs is his comrades and this place of work, which is a quarry, where they literally break stones, right, to raise his family. And the family is large. So that's front and center in the first 2 stanzas. Let me share the screen again. And so next stanza is even more interesting. Put it on record. I am an Arab. I am a name without a title. Patient in a country where everything lives in a whirlpool of anger. My roots took hold before the birth of time, before the burgeoning of the ages, before cypress and olive trees, before the proliferation of weeds. My father is from the family of the plow, not from high-born nobles. And my grandfather was a peasant without line or genealogy. My house is a watchman's hut made of sticks and reeds. Right? So once again, what's highlighted is the mere averageness of our narrator, right? I'm a peasant. I'm a man without a last name. I don't use Bey or Pasha or Sheikh with my name, and that my ancestry is that of the peasants, the Falahin, right, in Arabic, people who till the land, and that his generations upon generations have lived there, right, and tilled that land. So what's there is a claim to having existed on that land for centuries, and a claim to a heritage of working people, right? His claim to that land or to live in it and to work in it is not based in because he owned it or had a title to it, no, but because he and his fellow human beings lived there generation upon generation and worked with their hands. That's the heritage that he's claiming. And that his house, like a watchman's hut built with reeds, right? That's how most Palestinian houses are in the occupied territories, right? In the refugee camps. Most of the times a large family would be living in one house constructed out of waste materials. So all of this is highlighting his claim to the land, his desire to work to sustain his family, and the humble origins that he claims as history, but a claim to have lived in the land, for centuries. And then the refrain, why does this make you angry, right? What is there to be angry about? I'm here, I was here, I own no title, I work with my hands, and we have done this for centuries. What's there to be angry about, right? That's the refrain. Then, moving on, does my status satisfy you? I'm a name without a surname. Put it on record, I'm an Arab. Color of hair, jet black. Color of eyes, brown. My distinguishing features on my head, the equal cords over a cafe. Cafe, right? Scratching him who touches it. My address, I'm from a village, remote, forgotten. Its streets without name, and all its men in the fields and quarry. What's there to be angry about? Put it on record, I'm an Arab. You stole my forefathers' vineyards and land I used to till, I and my children, and you left us and all my grandchildren nothing but these rocks. Will your government be taking them too, as is being said? Right? So this is where the poem gets even more interesting, because he's particularizing his identity but connecting it to a kind of stereotype. What do people who are racist call the people who wear the kaifi, right? And a call on top of it, right? What are the stereotypes about them? When he mentions color of eyes, jet black, color of hair, brown, these are the things that would be mentioned on an ID card as identifying features, right? He's putting those right in front. And his address, right? I am from a village, remote and forgotten, right? And that's, has layers upon layers on it. There are hundreds of villages in the state of Israel that used to be Arab villages, right, that were obliterated after the Arabs moved to the refugee camps and new settlements were built on them, to a point that people 2 generations down from there don't even remember where their village was. So this is one of the villages that he comes from, right, that just barely exists in time and history, right? And then he goes on to, after having established who he is, not a nobleman, having lived the land for centuries, generation upon generation, having worked all his life and his ancestors, right? And now at the last edge of that, right, working in a quarry, right? What he's saying is, will you be taking this away too? It presupposes already that a lot has been taken away, and this is the last thing left, right? The quarry, from where he makes his living, right? So in a way, you can also imagine that this person, the narrator in the poem, has a great sense of loss, but is okay for as long as he can provide for his family, right? But that maybe is the last straw, right? And we can relate to it. You don't have to be a Palestinian to relate to it. You just have to imagine, as a human being, how would you feel if slowly and gradually everything is stripped away from you, taken over through law, through government, through occupation, until you're forced to a point where you can't even do the bare work of breaking rocks to provide for your family, right? And then we go towards the last stanza, which troubled a lot of people, as is being said. So put it on record at the top of page 1. I don't hate people. I trespass on no one's property. And yet, if I were to become hungry, I shall eat the flesh of my usurper. Beware, beware of my hunger and of my anger. Right? So what is the poem teaching us, right? It's taking us to the very point where a person has lost everything. the means of sustenance for his family, his job, his dignity, right? And any human being who thinks chronologically or logically about these things would tell you that in all literature, American, British, Israeli, when you are forced to that point as a human being, you're expected to rise up and fight for your rights. That's a natural human response. So by the time we get to the poem, we start as a Palestinian, right? But as he moves us through his prior claim to the land, his history of having worked it as a peasant, not owned it, right? And his current situation of having all children and this quarry job to provide for them, right? And as a reader, as you read it, what you're basically hoping is that he doesn't lose that job, because what will he do for his family? But that is where also the beginning of his resistant rage will emerge, right? Because after you take away everything from a people, individual or a group, they have nothing else to look towards. They will then fight to take back what you have taken away from them. That's the story being told. So in my opinion, the identity card touches on so many sensitive issues, right? It touches on questions of racial discrimination, religious discrimination, but it also complicates this stereotype about Palestinians, right? This idea that maybe they are essentially and inherently violent and hate-filled people, right? What it does is it plots a narrative kind of history of aggressions against the narrator, but also his people, the dispossession, right? And that finally they are driven to a point where they have nothing left. And what he's saying is, if I have nothing left, if my family has nothing left, then you will see my rage, right? My rage isn't already existent and it doesn't drive me. What drives my rage is all these losses, right? And don't push me to that point. I mean, that's the message. So that's how I read the poem. And now you can take it out of the Palestinian context, apply it to yourself, apply it to right now in American streets, right? The Black Lives Matter movement. How are they being treated, right? By the police, by the state institutions, the protesters. But why are they there in the streets? Because they have reached a point of symbolic and material dispossession where they're saying, this is not a just system. My interest, no one is taking care of me or my interest. No one is giving me full rights. So these people didn't just wake up and one morning said, oh no, I'm going to go in the, no. They can prove and articulate a long history of grievances and injustices until they reach a moment where they have to make a choice. Do I go and stand in the street with my comrades to resist this unjust racial order, right? That's exactly the kind of message this poem delivers, right, and gives us. So, what do we learn from it? We learn the particularities of the Palestinian experience. What does it take for a people to lose everything and then rise against their oppressors, right? In whatever way. The poem, of course, Mahmoud Darwish has always offered semiotic resistance through his work. And, if you have read your Barbara Harlow, I'll do a lecture on this beautiful book by this wonderful scholar. What she talks about is that there are two kinds of resistances all over the world, the material resistance, but the poetic and artistic resistance is equally as important and sometimes drives the material resistance, right? Or exhorts people to stand for their rights. That's its significance. So if Darwish is just a poet, that this poem highlights for the world, but also for Palestinians, this is what is happening to us, right? Here is an account of grievances, right? It's also telling the Israelis and their supporters and everyone else in the world that if you drive us against the wall, we have nowhere else to go, right? That's what will drive the rage, right? And then we can apply it to any wider situation in the world as a message of resistance a genealogy of resistance. So that's all I have to say about the poem. Please do read it carefully, and if you have any questions, concerns about the poem, share them with me, and I'll be happy to answer any questions. And with that, thank you so much, and peace and love.